Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, June 26th, 2021, and today we're going to be talking about what minority and population growth means for the Republican Party moving forward in a number of states in which we are going to be going through the minority breakdowns in a number of these states: Georgia, Arizona, Maryland, a number of states that are either crucial or not so crucial to the overall election cycle that will provide more insight as to what this means. How does a demographic shift actually change potential election results? In addition, we're going to be looking at the immediate future, 2024 and potentially 2028. It shows us a little bit more insight as to how direct demographic shifts will be impacting these states and what that means in terms of Republican ability to win in certain states that they otherwise would have had solidly in the bag had the demographics not changed so drastically. So in the 2020 election results, what we noticed was that there were certain states that had shifted to the left by pretty considerable amounts, or states that used to be solid for the Republican Party that were either won by Joe Biden or nearly won or came within a point of contention. Most notably is the state of Texas, with its now 40 electoral votes in the 2024 election. The reason why we look at it, it's a very large state with a majority-minority population that only continues to grow. And with that growth, the state continues to shift further towards the left. In addition, you have Georgia and Arizona, once long-lasting ruby red states that have now come down to be extremely competitive and down to a point where Democrats now have 2 senators from both of those states and just won it on the presidential level. Quite interesting to see how the states have drastically changed. It's not just Georgia, it's not just Arizona, it's not just Texas, it's the population growth in Colorado, in North Carolina, and Florida, and Alaska that cannot be ignored because it contributes to the state's ever-changing demographic groups and ever-changing electoral politics. And in 9 times out of 10, with the exception really being Florida, these states shift towards the left. And I find it to be sort of something that we largely expected following the 2016 election, when Hillary Clinton and the Democratic Party won minority voters by a larger margin than they did in 2020. This was meant to show that minority voters were moving away at large numbers from the Republican Party. Hillary Clinton did better than Barack Obama did in 2012 in this election, despite Obama winning amongst minority voters. Hillary Clinton outperformed him, but significantly underperformed amongst white voters. Well, at a point in time in American politics, the presidential contenders will be more inclined to win over minority voters than they will white voters. And that has not been the case for the entirety of American politics. That has not been the case for the entire history of this nation. For over 2 centuries now, we are looking at this country in a position where white voters have always been in the majority. Always been in the majority. Whether you're talking 70% of the population, 75, 80, amongst voter breakdown, much, much higher. I mean, the point of what we've seen so far is that American politics remains contentious largely because of white voters. And I'll explain what I mean by that. When you take a look at the exit polling data and the actual breakdown of how racial groups vote in every election, one thing you might notice is that the only demographic group that ever votes for the GOP, at least consistently, are white voters. They comprised, according to CNN's exit polls, 67% of the 2020 election total breakdown. Some estimate as high as 70%. But with CNN at 67%, and every other demographic group overwhelmingly voting for the Democratic Party, with the only one that was the narrowest being a 14-point margin, look at these breakdowns. The only reason why 2020 was competitive was because of white voters. Had it just been people of color voting, or more specifically, black voters voting, the result would be the exact same across the United States. Democrats would win every single state. Joe Biden and the Democrats won minority groups in every single state, except for white voters. And white voters won't be a minority until around 2045, as some of these U.S. Census Bureau estimates suggest. But the demographic changes hold immediate implications, because it's not just a determination as to whether or not the country will be majority-minority, but rather individual states. And for example, we've seen Georgia change over time, a state with a very large population, over 10 million residents at this point. Many voters, many crucial voters, and the racial breakdown here is that 60% of the voters in Georgia are white Americans. 31% are Black Americans. For reference, the entire nation is around 13% Black Americans, so Georgia has a considerably higher Black population than the rest of the nation. And one thing that you might notice is, hold on a second, maybe white voters aren't as Democratic in Georgia as they are in the rest of the nation. And that partially is true. When you take a look at how white voters vote in the state of Georgia, in many ways, they overwhelmingly support the Republican Party. Only recently have we seen major turnings in a bunch of these major counties in Georgia that ultimately led the state to vote blue. But just looking at the state itself, when you're talking about the breakdown, the way that Georgia used to be characterized before, what you might notice is that as we start to take a closer look at the demographic data, the state was whiter. When you take a look at the live births by single race, ethnicity of mother, you'll notice that based off of these numbers, you'll find that while white voters, non-Hispanic white voters, or not voters, non-Hispanic white babies are being born at a higher rate than any other group, the majority of the births are not from white mothers, which means that the state is only going to increase in terms of its overall minority population as time goes on. As every time, you go to and look at the census data, every year, year after year after year, sooner or later, you are going to start to see majority minority pop up as a possibility for the state of Georgia. And it's not alone in that determination. In fact, many states can be determined to be majority minority. When you take a look at the non-Hispanic white population across the rest of the country, if a state is gray, that means that non-Hispanic white voters, or not white voters, I say voters because this is an election channel, I'm used to saying that, but non-Hispanic white citizens are the majority, over 60% of the population in every single one of those gray states. But in the states that are yellow, they are less than 60% of the population. In states that are orange, less than 50% of the population. And that's where it gets really interesting, because it gives you an indication of which states might eventually become orange. And then you can start to decode, this is why New Mexico is getting more left-wing. This is why Texas is now competitive versus it used to not be competitive at all. This is why California and Hawaii are safe Democratic states. And then it raises the question about voter suppression. When you take a look at Mississippi and Louisiana, Mississippi with one of the largest Black populations in the country, yet not nearly as competitive or competitive really at all, you have to ask why. It's not because Black voters vote for Republicans, it's simply because minority voters in Mississippi do not vote at the same rate as minority voters do in Texas, or they do in Georgia, or Florida, or New York, or New Jersey, or Maryland, or any other states with a similar characterization in terms of majority-minority states. And actually, Vox released, this list here. I think this is from the States of Change, the Demographic Evolution of the American Electorate by the Center for American Progress, where they sort of tell us when they think that the states will become majority-minority, which states will be in a position where they will eventually become mostly non-white voters. And or not even non-white voters, but majority-minority. Some of these states have already passed that. New Mexico, California, Texas. And if you're looking at Maryland, actually, this is my home state, this seems to be spot on. What we looked at is that this article was released in 2015, but it provides an estimation, sort of a prediction as to when these states can be characterized as such. And I didn't believe it. I saw Maryland in 2020, and I said, wait a second, it doesn't seem like Maryland is majority-minority. I mean, I live in Prince George's County, which is absolutely majority-minority, but I did not think that the rest of the state had come to that point where we would see a majority-minority state such as Maryland. Well, then I check the U.S. Census Bureau, and I go ahead and check out the census quick facts for the state of Maryland, and I notice that white alone, meaning non-Hispanic white voters or white citizens, sorry about that, are 50% of the population. So while we are a year behind, I would say, in terms of what the estimations are, and then again, the census is always a year behind in terms of their estimations as well, it seems to be right. What we're seeing happen in a number of these states are that, not only in Georgia, not only in Maryland, not only in Texas, but also in other states, including Arizona. If you're taking a look, this is actually old numbers from 2000 to 2005, but you can see that Black voters grow at a higher rate than white voters, that Asian voters grow at a higher rate than white voters. And I think that it is just quite interesting to see how the populations have changed when they sometimes group Hispanic voters or Hispanic citizens under the white breakdown. You can sort of see where why they have the numbers, because there is no Hispanic race option when it comes down to demographic groups. You have white, you have black, you have Native American, you have Asian, Pacific Islander, but you don't have Hispanic. They ask that question completely separately, but then you have to self-identify on the next tab or the next question. But when they actually do the breakdowns, you'll notice that non-Hispanic white voters or white citizens tend to be growing at a higher rate than Hispanic white citizens grow at a higher rate than non-Hispanic white citizens. And if you're looking at the way that each racial breakdown group votes in elections, it's consistent. Even if these voters that are considered to be Hispanic/Latino are considered white by the U.S. Census, they still vote for Democrats. The divide here is between non-Hispanic white voters and the rest of the nation. That's exactly what we're seeing happen across the country. That's exactly why the Republican Party has been in a position where they've been able to win Arizona and Texas and Georgia, and now they've become swing states. It gives us an understanding as to why the GOP was previously, not in the 21st century, but prior to, competitive in California. Why they were competitive in a couple of other states. But now they have majority-minority populations, which means that the majority-minority populations are going to be voting overwhelming for the Democratic Party, even if white voters do not. But the rest of the nation still holds a very much overwhelmingly white population. When you're looking at a number of states, especially in the Northeast and across the Midwest, you are seeing states that probably won't reach majority-minority status for at least 4, 5, 6 decades. And that's just because of population trends. But it makes it more difficult for the GOP to win elections with states growing in terms of their minority populations. And also, just regular population growth as well. You see, what happened in 2016 with Donald Trump was that he was able to counteract the gains from Hillary Clinton amongst minority voters relative to Barack Obama in 2012 by winning over white voters. Florida was sort of an anomaly. Hillary Clinton did very well amongst Hispanic voters in Florida, but white voters turned away from the Democrats after previously voting for them in 2012. But looking at Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Iowa, these states were crucial in counteracting the gains made by Hillary Clinton. Georgia got closer than it was in 2012. Texas got closer than it was in 2012. Arizona got closer than it was in 2012. The reason being, the states have grown in population, combined with Donald Trump being a lackluster candidate for those 3 individual states. Let's take a look at 2004. This was the last time the GOP really maximized their Sunbelt efforts, because George W. Bush did very well amongst minority voters, specifically amongst Hispanic voters. That led him to victory in Florida by 5 points, the largest we've seen during the 21st century. Then he won in Texas by 23 points. For reference, Donald Trump won that state by just 5.6%. Bush won Georgia by 17 points, Arizona by 11 points. In addition, these states were not nearly as high in terms of minority composition until later on. So what happened in Arizona and Georgia and Texas is not just the states voting for a Democrat out of spite for Donald Trump being the Republican nominee, but combined with the fact that minority citizens have become a much higher portion of the population across these states, which I think is just quite interesting to see just how drastically these margins have changed. So it puts the Republican Party in a position where they used to win in Arizona, Texas, and Georgia, but they can't now. Where Democrats have become viable candidates in these races, to a point where Democrats only really need to win all of the states they won in the 2016 election and can completely disregard the rest as long as they're able to win Texas. And while that does seem like a large feat, for reference, Texas was, closer for Trump than Colorado was for Biden, or Virginia was for Biden, or New Mexico was for Biden, or New Hampshire was for Biden, or Minnesota was for Biden. Understand that Texas has gotten closer because that same type of thinking on part of the GOP to neglect the demographic shifts in Texas, the shift in support in Texas is exactly what lost them Georgia. It's exactly what lost them Arizona. And what is going to lose them? Texas. because denying the inevitable shift, denying the population changes across the states was proven to be detrimental for the GOP. Demographic breakdowns show that Democrats do better amongst minority voters. And this is the first time we've actually been in consideration where in our lifetimes, the United States will become majority minority. What that means is, essentially, this is the first time in United States history where we will ever experience this. So we aren't entirely sure. Georgia, as another example, the University of Georgia Institute of Government shows here that a professor released this report where they talked about the population growth between 2000 and 2010. And you can sort of extrapolate this to 2020. But what you'll notice is that the percent change amongst white people in the state of Georgia went from, 5.6% in terms of overall percent change. Amongst black citizens, 25%, other, 75%, Hispanic citizens, 96%. So white citizens at 6% seems like, okay, that's a growth, but it's not nearly as high as it is for any other group. The doubling time for white citizens would be 117 years. For black citizens, 28 years. For Hispanic citizens, just 9 years. And when you look, I'm sure the Democratic Party is looking at that and is very happy about that. They are very happy hearing these changes because they know that with the nation getting more majority minority, and I know that seems like an oxymoron, but understand that, minority groups cannot be treated as just one monolith, but in terms of voting results, you can sort of differentiate between white voters and minority voters. But looking at the growth themselves, it shows that the Democratic Party will be at a better position based off of our current understanding of racial voting blocks. And the same exact, voting demographic groups, the same type of breakdown for the past couple of elections. And if that continues, the GOP will be in a pretty detrimental position because it'll make states such as Florida harder to win. As you start to see more minorities go into that state, it will be harder to win. North Carolina, another example. Looking at some of these states, if you're looking at the South and the West, that's exactly where the population seems to be growing. When you take a look at the states that have lost in terms of electoral votes, it's in the Rust Belt and in the Northeast. What do you have? New York, losing 1 electoral vote. Pennsylvania, losing 1. Ohio, losing 1. West Virginia, losing 1. Michigan, losing 1. Illinois, losing 1. That's interesting. But in terms of the states that are growing, in a very similar region. Florida, gaining 1. North Carolina, gaining 1. Texas, gaining 2. California loses 1, but to compensate for the gain, and Oregon gaining 1, and Colorado gaining 1 as well. The main takeaway should be that as we start to see these minority shifts across the nation, understand what this does electorally. Because while the majority of the country won't be majority minority until 2024, take a look at when some of these states are expected to become majority minority. Arizona and Georgia, based off this article in 2015, could have been the next that the GOP could have realized, holy crap, these states might flip next. They're estimated to be in that position. And they did. Then you have Florida, New Jersey, already a blue state. Alaska, which I find to be a state that we really don't discuss much, but it was a state that was decided by just 10 points. And I know I'm saying just 10 points, but for perspective, Alaska was closer than New Mexico, Colorado, and Virginia. Isn't that fascinating? That Alaska was closer than New Mexico, Colorado, and Virginia. So what I'm seeing here is that this is an early indication list for the GOP to understand how some of these states might be changing in terms of population and how that could be their downfall in the future. What this could mean. It is just quite interesting to see how much these states have actually changed, what this change actually means relative to the election results, because sooner or later, at some point, the Democratic and Republican parties will no longer be worried about winning just white voters in order to win the election, not winning just the white working class in order to win the Rust Belt, but rather winning minority voters at large amounts, because right now they heavily skew towards the Democratic Party, which means that with this growth, it makes it increasingly more difficult for the GOP to win in elections after elections unless something dramatically changes about their outreach, about their platform, or the constituents that they resonate with. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist from my post 2020 election analysis videos. I want to cover a couple more videos talking about minority ships because they hold so much information and so much more than what can just be covered in one video. So comment down what you would like me to do with this information, what you would like me to explore even further. But again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.